Two men arrive, not as guests, but as executioners. By sunset, one of the most feared generals of World War II will be dead. Not on the battlefield, but by his own hand. No gunfire, no trial. Just a choice, wrapped in silence. Inside a quiet villa, a family waits, unaware that history is about to fracture their lives forever. A father, a husband, a legend, forced into a corner where loyalty means death and defiance means destroying everything he loves. Outside, the regime closes in. Inside, time runs out. What happens next is not just a death, it is a carefully staged illusion. A hero's farewell, hiding a truth too dangerous to be spoken. By late 1944, the war had already begun to turn against Germany. The front lines were collapsing, trust inside the Cleata was eroding, and suspicion had become more dangerous than any bullet. In this atmosphere of hoof and betrayal, even the most respected figures were no longer safe. And among them stood one of the most celebrated commanders of the war, a man admired by both his own cohort and even his enemies. But reputation, in a Nizamov built on absolute loyalty, could quickly become a threat. Behind closed doors, whispers had started to grow. Names were being extracted under interrogation. The failed attempt to assassinate Hitler on the 20th of July had unleashed a mawj of paranoia. Officers were arrested, interrogated, and forced to confess. Under pressure, some pointed toward a figure that few would have imagined could ever be accused, a man once trusted at the highest levels of command. Whether he was truly part of the conspiracy or not almost didn't matter anymore. In such a system, suspicion alone could be a death sentence. Then came the quiet arrival, not with soldiers storming in, not with chains or weapons drawn, but with two high-ranking officers carrying something far more terrifying than force, an ultimatum. They didn't shout, they didn't threaten loudly, they simply laid out the reality with cold precision. There would be no fair trial, no chance to defend himself, no escape, only two paths. One would lead to a public courtroom controlled entirely by the regime, a place where verdicts were decided before the trial even began. It would not end with justice, but with humiliation, torture, and execution. And it would not stop with him. His family, his wife, his son would be dragged into the consequences, their lives destroyed, their name erased. The other path was quieter, faster, final. If he chose to take his own life, everything would be different. The regime would protect his family. His name would be honored. The world would be told a different story, a heroic one. He would be buried with dignity, remembered as a legend, not as a traitor. It was not a choice between life and death. It was a choice between two kinds of death. It was a choice between two kinds of death, one filled with pain, disgrace, and the destruction of everything he loved. The other wrapped in silence, but preserving the future of his family. In that moment, the battlefield disappeared. There were no strategies, no troops, no victories to plan. Only a man standing at the edge of his own legacy, forced to decide how his story would end. This was not the kind of war history usually remembers. No explosions, no marching armies, just a quiet room, a devastating decision, and the crushing realization that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one standing behind you. Inside the villa, the world felt still, almost untouched by the chaos consuming Europe. The walls held memories of quieter days, of conversations that had nothing to do with war, of a life that once felt normal. But on that day, the silence carried a different weight. It wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating, because outside, everything had already changed. The truth had arrived at their doorstep, carried not by rumors, but by men who left no room for doubt. And now, inside that house, a family stood on the edge of a decision that no family should ever have to face. He gathered them, his wife, his son, not as a commander giving orders, but as a man about to disappear from their lives. The uniform, the medals, the reputation, none of it mattered in that moment. What remained was something far more human. A husband, a father, a man who knew that whatever choice he made would echo through the lives of the people standing in front of him. There was no easy path to explain. How do you tell your family that your life is no longer your own? How do you explain that survival, might cost them everything. His wife listened, but her heart refused to accept it. To her, there had to be another way. A way to fight the accusations. A way to stand against the Nizam and demand justice. She saw not a trapped man, but someone who could still resist, still speak, still defend his name. Because giving up felt like surrendering not just his life, but the truth itself. But he saw it differently. He understood the machinery behind the decision. He knew how trials like this ended. He knew that once inside that system there would be no voice, no defense, no mercy. It wasn't a question of innocence anymore. It was a question of control. And control was something the regime would never allow him to have again. Then there was his son, young, watching, trying to understand a moment far beyond his years. This wasn't just a conversation. It was a lesson about the brutal reality of power, loyalty, and sacrifice. A moment where childhood ends without warning. Where the safety of a father's presence is suddenly replaced by the fear of losing him forever. And yet, in the middle of all this, the decision wasn't only about him, it was about them. If he chose to fight, they would suffer. Their names would be stained, their lives could be destroyed before they even had a chance to continue. The consequences wouldn't stop at the courtroom. They would follow his family into every corner of their future. If he chose silence, if he chose death on his own terms, they would be protected, allowed to live, allowed to remember him not as a criminal, but as a hero. It was a cruel equation. Truth or survival, honor or protection. And no matter what he chose, something would be lost forever. In that room, the war was no longer about nations or armies. It had shrunk down to something painfully personal. A family forced to weigh love against reality, hope against certainty, and the unbearable cost of doing what might save each other. At the price of everything else, 4 days later, the world witnessed a scene of honor, discipline, and national grief. Flags lowered, soldiers standing in perfect formation, voices speaking of bravery, sacrifice, and unwavering loyalty. It looked like the farewell of a hero, a man who had given everything for his country and had finally succumbed to his wounds. But beneath that carefully constructed image, something was deeply wrong. Because this funeral was not just a ceremony. It was a performance. Every detail had been arranged with precision. The narrative had already been written before the first word of the eulogy was spoken. According to the official story, he had died as a result of injuries sustained in battle. A tragic but honorable end. For a legendary commander, it was clean, it was simple, and most importantly, it was believable. The public saw what they were meant to see. A coffin draped in dignity. Speeches filled with praise. A nation mourning one of its finest soldiers. But none of it reflected the truth. The reality was far more uncomfortable. Far more dangerous. Because if people knew how he had really died, forced into a corner, even an ultimatum, silenced by his own leadership, it would have shattered the image the regime depended on. It would have raised questions, doubt, even anger. So the truth had to be buried along with him. Even those standing closest to the coffin carried a silence heavier than grief. His wife, his son, they listened as the story of his death was retold in a way that erased the final painful decision he had been forced to make. They heard words that honored him, yet concealed what truly happened in those final moments. And they said nothing. Not because they agreed with the lie, but because they understood the cost of breaking it. To speak the truth in that moment would not have brought justice. It would have brought consequences. The same system that had forced his hand was still in power, still watching, still capable of turning its attention toward anyone who dared to challenge the official version of events. So silence became their only protection. Around them, the ceremony continued with absolute confidence. High-ranking officials delivered speeches, unaware or perhaps unwilling to acknowledge the deeper reality. They spoke of loyalty, of courage, of a man who had remained faithful until the very end. The irony hung in the air, unnoticed by most, but painfully clear to those who knew. This was not just about honoring the dead, it was about controlling the living. By shaping how he was remembered, the regime preserved its own authority. A hero's death was useful. It inspired. It maintained order. It prevented doubt. but a forced suicide, a betrayal from within. That was dangerous. That was something that could spread like a crack in a wall, threatening everything built upon it. So the story remained intact. The world moved forward, believing in a version of events that had been carefully crafted, polished, and presented as truth. And for a time, it worked. The illusion held. The name remained untarnished in the public eye, but at the cost of reality itself, because, sometimes, the most powerful weapon is not force, but narrative. And in this case, the final act of a man's life was rewritten, transformed into something acceptable, something safe, while the truth was left behind, hidden in the memories of those who were forced to carry it in silence. For months, the story remained untouched, sealed behind official statements and unquestioned belief. The world had already accepted the version it was given, a respected commander taken by the lingering effects of his injuries. It sounded reasonable, it sounded complete, and in a time when Harblood was still raging, few had the space or the courage to question it. But truth has a strange nature. It waits. It survives in silence, in memory, in the quiet spaces where fear once lived. As the war began to collapse and the Sayotara of the regime weakened, the walls that had protected the lie started to crack. Cities fell. Armies retreated. And with them, the power to control every narrative began to slip away. The same system that had once dictated what people believed was now struggling just to survive. And in that shifting world, the truth found its moment. When Allied forces moved into German territory, they didn't just bring military control. They brought questions, investigations, a need to understand what had really happened behind the closed doors of a regime built on secrecy. They searched for answers not just on battlefields, but inside homes, inside lives that had been shaped by years of fear and silence. That is when the story began to change. In a quiet house, far from the noise of Yud, the official version of events was finally challenged. There were no crowds, no cameras, just a conversation. Calm, direct, and long overdue. The kind of moment where history is not written with speeches, but with truth spoken carefully, almost cautiously, as if it still carried the weight of danger. His wife began to speak, not as a public figure, not as someone seeking attention, but as someone who had carried a burden for too long. She described what had really happened on that day. The arrival, the ultimatum, the decision that no one should ever be forced to make. Every detail quietly dismantled the story the world had believed. Her son confirmed it. Piece by piece, the illusion collapsed. What had once been presented as a natural death was now revealed as something far more complex, far more tragic. A controlled ending, a forced silence, a moment where power had overridden truth and reshaped reality to fit its own needs. For the first time, those outside that system could see it clearly. This wasn't just about correcting a historical detail. It was about exposing how easily truth can be manipulated when fear controls the narrative. How even the death of a national figure could be rewritten to serve a purpose, and how those closest to the truth are often the ones forced to hide it the longest. But even then, the revelation did not come with dramatic headlines or immediate global shock. It spread slowly, carefully, because truth, after being buried for so long, doesn't explode into the world. It emerges, step by step, carried by those willing to finally let it be known. And in that quiet release, something powerful happened. The man the world thought it knew became someone far more complicated. Not just a hero, not just a victim, but a figure caught in the machinery of a system that could elevate and destroy in the same breath. The silence had been broken, but the questions it left behind would echo far beyond that moment, reaching into history itself, challenging not just how he died, but what his life had truly meant after the war. The name that had names struck fear across continents took on a new meaning. The battlefield had ended, but the story was far from over. His son, still carrying the weight of a father lost under impossible circumstances, stepped into a world that had been rebuilt from rubble and ash. Germany itself was trying to redefine what it meant to be a nation, what it meant to survive, and what it meant to reconcile with the past. For him, This was not just a personal challenge. It was a mission to transform a legacy shaped by war into something that could inspire life, not death. He entered public service quietly at first, learning the ways of governance, law, and politics. His surname was recognized, but he rarely spoke of his father's deeds in professional circles. There was a careful balance to maintain, acknowledging the past without letting it dictate the present. In the streets and offices of post-war Germany, the shadow of his father loomed large, but he understood that real influence would not come from fame alone. It would come from action, from decisions that reshaped communities, from leadership grounded in principle rather than reputation. As he rose through administrative ranks, he began to embody something remarkable. Where his father had been a figure of strategy and war, he became a figure of reconciliation and pragmatism. Cities, once divided by ideology and destruction, were transformed under his guidance. He championed integration, inclusion, and economic growth, often pushing against conservative resistance to do what he believed was right. His leadership was defined not by force or fear, but by compromise, empathy, and vision. Perhaps his most striking achievement was the way he approached the past, not by ignoring it, but by transforming it. While other post-war leaders focused on retribution or forgetting, he used his position to build bridges. He forged friendships with the sons of his father's wartime rivals, creating personal connections that symbolized a broader reconciliation between nations. Military history, once a source of division, became a foundation for understanding, dialogue, and cooperation. His ability to turn inherited notoriety into a platform for unity was extraordinary, showing that the weight of a family name could be carried with responsibility and purpose. Over decades, his career became a testament to the possibility of change. Where one generation had been defined by conflict, the next could redefine that same name through service, empathy, and diplomacy. Honors from around the world acknowledged his efforts, not for battles fought, but for bridges built. Awards from Israel, Britain, France, and Germany itself recognized a life dedicated